Welcome, everybody. I'm Adrian Davis, your host, and this show is about one simple truth, and that is that when the stakes are high, your customer is the hero. And this changes everything in sales, leadership, and growth. Over the course of this series, I'm going to be exploring 6 principles of the high stakes customer. And these principles are really designed to help you see your customer more clearly, engage with them more meaningfully, and show up as the guide they need. Today, I have a special guest. We're going to be opening this program today with Sandeep Aujla, and she is an executive and team coach who works with leaders operating in complex, high-pressure environments, particularly in the healthcare space. Her experience spans healthcare systems, executive teams, and organizations where decisions carry real human, financial, and reputational consequences. With a background in organizational psychology and executive strategy, Sandeep brings a deep understanding of both how leaders think and how systems behave under strain. So in this conversation, we're going to explore what truly drives executive decision-making, executive decision-making with competing priorities, limited capacity, risk, reputation, and constant trade-offs. And that's something I think a lot of people who are selling to executives don't necessarily appreciate, is the trade-offs these executives have to make when they're making decisions. So Sandeep's going to help us unpack how alignment and tension inside leadership teams shapes outcomes, timelines, and stakeholder influence. So this episode is designed to help sales professionals show up as credible thinking partners who can read the room, ask better questions, and earn trust by demonstrating that they are focused on the executive's reality and not just closing the deal. Well, I'm super excited about that. With that, Sandeep, welcome.
Thank you so much, Adrian. It's my pleasure to be here.
You know, I was really impressed with you. So we're members of the Canadian Association of Professional Speakers, and we were at the conference for CAPS last month. And I just got to talking with you. We met at the airport, and very quickly, I was just sensitive to your insight and engagement at an executive level. And I thought, wow, you know what? You would make a great guest on my podcast. And so maybe if you don't mind, just taking a few minutes just to share your journey with us. What has led you to the path you're on now? And what is your background? I've given a little bit in the intro, but just to help people understand where you're coming from.
Absolutely. So I am trained as an organizational psychology practitioner, which basically means that it's an MBA that is focused on evidence. So it brings the heart of people and organizations, and it brings the evidence, which is around the metrics, which is very key, especially when you're talking about healthcare settings, where people really care about patient outcomes and both the positive and the negative, and also the burden to demonstrate to regulators that you are delivering the value that you have promised in a very competitive landscape. So talking about my journey, Adrian, I have zigzagged tons, similar to you, but I would say with healthcare, I first worked internally at a few teaching hospitals in Ontario, in Canada. And then when I started my company in 2016, still continued to serve most of the healthcare organizations, and that spanned the entire spectrum. So we talk about the acute care hospitals, both in urban areas and rural, and then all the way from emergency care and paramedics to long-term care, seniors care, community living, independent living, and the whole spectrum, basically, when you think about the human journey.
I love it. I love this experience. And I love the fact that you're coming from sort of inside the 4 walls, and now in a sense you're outside, but still very much a collaborative partner. So you're sort of spanning both inside the health systems as well as understanding the world outside. With that as context, then the first thing I'd like us to explore is a lot of the sales professionals that are selling into healthcare, like the healthcare professionals themselves, they care about patient outcomes. And I think many people are gravitating to this space because they care about improving patient outcomes. On the other hand, if you're in sales, you have a number, you're trying to reach a number. And sometimes we can be overly focused on maybe the quantitative results and missing the patient outcomes on one hand, or we're so focused on the patient outcomes, we're not able to demonstrate quantitative impact. Maybe you could just start from your vantage point of knowing what goes on inside. If I'm a sales professional selling to healthcare executives, maybe what are some of the perspectives that they have that are not necessarily obvious to me as I'm trying to position my value?
That is a great question. And actually, listening to you introduce this podcast helped me realize how many parallels there are between executive coaching and being a salesperson who is serving healthcare executives.
Right
Because
on.
we are thinking partners. We are basically eyes and ears outside, bringing that in as a partner to say, hey, have you noticed that this is happening and what the possible implication for you could be, rather than just at the end point where I'm trying to sell a service without understanding if you need it or not. We ask great questions. We want to understand what your actual pain point is so that we can serve it effectively. So from that parallel, I will say any salesperson who is serving healthcare, doesn't matter whether it's hospitals or another healthcare organization, you want to start by understanding who exactly are you serving. So is your product or service going to impact a certain specialty group? Is it going to be focused on employees or patients? And then everybody else who touches the decision, because the decision making in hospitals is extremely complex.
Very
But
cool.
it's even more complex if you're serving healthcare systems, which is the trend that you will see is happening rapidly.
Absolutely.
Like so much so yesterday, New Jersey, one of their largest not-for-profit systems, just acquired or will be acquiring the last independent hospital in New Jersey.
Wow.
That is
Wow.
incredible. We're talking
Wow.
45,000 plus people. We're
Wow.
talking 700 plus sites. So when you think about the complexity of the system, it's important to understand who the final product will be impacting. Who would be the decision maker that actually holds the rights around budget? Who is the clinical partner that must have to approve to make sure that the quality of care is maintained, that the burden is reduced, that the metrics that really matter? So, for example, let's say a product was somehow going to make a difference in, like it's a tech product, let's say,
Yes.
and it's going to create efficiency. That's always the goal.
Yes.
But somehow it requires more clicks, more cognitive burden for the nurses to make sure that they are remembering to do this extra step. It may seem simple as an outsider, but to start thinking about what the journey for all the people touching that product internally, that lens means that you're not just selling to whoever is controlling the budget, in this case, probably a CIO
Yes.
with support from CFO, but also the chief nursing officer,
Mhm.
also possibly some of the other union reps. We don't think so far about the people that may have influence in
Yes.
getting that buy-in. And one of the things that hospitals are notorious for is remembering all the things that failed, all the
Right.
technologies and services and workflows that were incorporated but never truly implemented to success. So
Wow.
with that memory, it's important that you bring in the sales process who those key influencers are supposed to be. So you're almost kind of partnering with
Yes.
your primary
Yes.
executive to bring along others so that they feel their status is maintained, their perspective is included, and they have a buy-in in the eventual success of adopting whatever you were selling, a service or a product.
Sandeep, you have me transfixed. I could listen to you for hours, and you said so much there. There's just so much that you've given us. I want to go back to kind of where you started, which was a
Mhm,
fascinating comment, which was, when I introduced the podcast today, you said, as I was listening to this, I saw a lot of parallels between what sales professionals are doing and what we do as executive coaches, showing up as thinking partners. Have you noticed a particular new trend? Can
mhm,
we think through the implications of this? I kind of just want to go back to that comment because that was such a profound comment. And I think, you're coming at it as an executive coach. Salespeople are calling on these same stakeholders. And sometimes because we are so technology focused, for example, if we are technology vendors, that we're not showing up as thinking partners. We're
mhm.
showing up to talk about the impact that we can have on efficiency. You said, as a thinking partner, you're asking great questions. You're helping them think through the implications. You're helping them think through who the stakeholders are that could be impacted. Can we just double click on that notion of being a coach, being a thinking partner?
Yeah.
What does that look like? What does that sound like? How would you advise salespeople to adopt that persona rather than the vendor persona?
It's a great question, and it's something that can be multifaceted. But I think there's this one angle that may be particularly useful to your listeners, and that is thinking from the leadership lens. There are supervisors who are closest to the ground, and then there are executives at the system level that are so far removed. The number one job of the executives, the ultimate decision makers, is around organizational strategy, which means that in order to be a strategic partner or a thinking partner, I need to start thinking strategically.
Right
So
on.
what does that may possibly mean for vendors and for executive coaches is thinking long term, thinking from a system perspective, thinking about the interconnections. So it's not just my product or service to you, Adrian. It is you, Adrian, who is within the system and is trying to accomplish some goals that are important to you, which means I need to understand how
Yes.
you fit within the system, what the system is trying to do, what are you trying to do, and then me keeping tabs on the long game. It's not a one-hit wonder that
Yes,
I'm going to sell this
exactly.
product and then we're gone. Both
Exactly.
coaching and whatever you're selling, especially if you're selling at a higher scale, that is probably a long-term implementation, long-term contact, and hopefully the greatest success is that these executives want a long-term relationship where they can trust us. That can
Love
only
it.
happen if we're bringing something to the table.
Right on.
So, what are you doing as salespeople to not just be masters in whatever you're selling, but understanding the context, environment, keeping tabs on what's happening externally, keeping perhaps Google alerts on your
Yeah.
key clients to know before media releases happen what may be happening internally, watching some other sources like Glassdoor to see what is the chatter that is happening inside the organization. So there are so many ways I would say that if somebody is willing to invest to be a
Yes.
strategic thinker, they will then be easily able to establish themselves as a thinking partner.
It's amazing. So followers of the High Stakes Customer podcast, as well as folks who've worked with Whetstone, understand that the hero's journey is the
Mm.
fundamental model of our entire approach. And so you mentioned that economic decision maker who's responsible for strategy, who controls the budget, who we see as the fundamental hero, the main character of the story, who we have to understand their strategy. We have to understand their long-term goals, and we need to show up as a partner, as a collaborator with them to help them achieve those goals. But to do that, not only do we have to understand the goals, we need to also understand these external factors that are going
Mhm.
to interfere or support those goals, as well as the internal factors that will interfere or support the goals. So it's amazing listening to you, Sandeep, because you're speaking the hero's journey without necessarily using the same language, but the same absolute principles. I
Yeah.
wouldn't mind if we could explore for a moment, because you said something around strategy, but you also said, the last independent hospital in New Jersey was
Mhm.
acquired. So this is a trend we're seeing, the consolidation of healthcare institutions, moving to these broader, bigger systems. Now,
Mhm.
I might feel intimidated as a salesperson, first of all. And I'm going to say, when I say salesperson, we're talking about some very high end, very professional people. Think sales executives who are responsible
Right.
for sales. So these are not, junior people. But at the
Mhm.
same time, they may feel a bit of intimidation selling at a strategic level and talking about strategy already just sort of at a hospital level. And now what
Mhm.
we're hearing is, no, now it's at a system level. And
Yeah.
that sounds like it's a lot more complicated, a lot more challenging. There's a lot more moving parts. I think you mentioned 45,000 employees. Uh,
Mhm.
what would you want people to understand about strategy and talking and engaging at a strategic level that perhaps it's not going to sound so intimidating, even though we're dealing now with systems rather than
Yeah.
individual institutions?
If you will allow me, I'm going to go back to the beginning of your comment around the hero's journey because I think the answer to your question is less about strategy and going back to that foundational universal truth of the hero's journey. I completely appreciate, you know what? I get intimidated. I have been serving executives for 10 plus years in intimate, roles
Yes.
and being that thinking partner. And sometimes I feel, oh my God, how could I possibly be the one supporting them? Two things that help. One is to remember that it's not about me.
Right
They
on.
are the
Wow.
hero, right?
Wow.
So if I lose the focus on me and thinking, am I enough or not? And put the focus on them to remember and feel the compassion of how difficult their role is. They're
Mhm.
people at the end of the day,
Mhm.
and they don't get compassion that easily. They get a lot of scrutiny. They get scrutiny from media, patients, people, all the uncertainty and tension that exists in healthcare. All of that is put back on leaders. They don't get the compassion to realize that the outcomes they are held accountable for, they have very little control over. They are working in a system that is pulling them in every direction possible. They're working with impossible trade offs. It's not good versus bad. It's like, which is the least worst or which
Mm.
is the better option. So if somebody were to show up with that compassion, with a focus on the leader, I think the energy and the presence you will bring automatically sets you apart because you're not there to prove, you're there to create some space for making them seen, heard, and understood at a very human level. I think there is something to be said about starting off with that mindset rather than a performance mindset.
Wow.
And I watched a lot of your videos. I'm
Great.
like, who cannot learn about sales more? So I thought, okay, this is interesting because in coaching, we have this perspective that we do not know the solution to your problem. We can
Right.
help you figure out the solution to your problem.
And
How do we
sorry,
do
I don't
that?
mean to interrupt, but let me just say this because my background is sales
Okay.
and teaching, and sort of initially you show up with the answer, and you just have to convince others of the answer. And
Interesting.
what I'm finding now is it is the coaching mindset that is superior and is what is needed because of what you said around compassion. And I love what you said. It's not a performance mindset.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a compassionate mindset, an empathetic mindset. So I think you're onto something here. That this coaching mindset of I'm going to show up with great questions. I don't feel any obligation to have the answer. You're the expert. I'm just going to help you think at
Yes.
a clearer level. I'm going to be a sounding board and guide you to your answer. Maybe you could just talk a bit more about this coaching mindset versus
Mm-hmm.
persuasion mindset and performance mindset.
Right. Because performance is centered on me. Look at me. I
Yes.
am the expert and I can solve any problem. Coaching mindset is you are the expert and I'm creating space for you. I'm creating space for you to gain your own clarity, to
Right on.
hear what you're thinking. Because how often do you actually meet people that are repeating what you just said? There is
Mhm.
power in hearing. So if I were to actually narrow it down further, specific to your audience, I would say start with goals around helping the client name some things. First of all, name what is the problem that they really cannot live with anymore. That will indicate change readiness. So you don't have to convince them,
Mhm.
right? And then you're not going in with the performance mindset that my product is the best solution for you.
Yeah.
No, it may or may not be.
Yes.
So
And,
you
and
will
even if it
figure
is,
out.
even if it is, they may not be ready for it. So this notion of
Exactly.
change readiness.
Is huge, which is starting with them naming the problem. And
Right.
how you name the problem is actually allowing them to name the tensions that lie
Mhm.
within the problem. So, for example, when I think about hospitals specifically, I don't know a single hospital that is not struggling with patient flow. Every
Yes.
single one of them. They will look at some of the key metrics around, if you think about patient flow, that impacts how quickly, how well, and how high quality that care was so that people are not returning back. Because hospitals are actually suffering financially when patients who've been discharged, they're readmitted in a certain period, usually 30 days.
Yes.
So
Yes.
things like that, having some basic idea about helping the client figure out what is a real problem? What is a real pain point? So not just the first question, what's not working, but going
Mhm.
deeper, almost like the five whys without
Mhm.
being, robotic about it. And once they say it, help them name the trade-off. Because usually anything that will create efficiency will probably mean something needs to change. Nothing changes if nothing changes, which means who will have to expend more cognitive energy? Who will have to say yes, that we're willing to try something different? So then you're bringing them in to identify who those. Remember when you and I met at CAPS, we talked about Bill Bratton from who was an ex-police chief for New York Police, and he was studied by Harvard Business Review researchers. And they said, you don't have to hit the entire culture to create a change. You just have to find key influencers.
Right on.
So who are those people with or without titles that will be critical for solving this problem? Who needs to feel status that, oh, I was one who said, yes, we should bring this in. So not just the executive you're talking to, but sharing that grace and power with others. So helping them name the trade-offs, the key, partners who have influence. And then ultimately, I would say, name what is that small win that will be immediately realized, and then the long-term plan. Because you want implementation to be part of your sale. Because if you just, I'm just giving a generic example.
Yes.
But if you give a solution or a service, you sell it and it's not implemented well, completely, or with all the resources needed, your reputation is at risk because it's not going to deliver the ROI that you've promised. So selling and naming, what will it take? There's this thing called the IKEA effect. The reason people love things that they get from IKEA. Why? Because they have to assemble it themselves.
Exactly.
And the harder you work, the greater ownership it creates in you. So it's almost like these are the things we do in executive coaching, is creating the space to help them name their pain, get clarity, figure out all the options, figure out all the trade-offs, get clarity on who need to partner, and then come up with an implementation plan. Honestly, that feels like a parallel between sales folks and coaches.
I just love everything that you've said. And I've never actually heard it said that way, how important it is to name the problem, to name the tension, to identify the stakeholders, to name the trade-offs. I think that's very, very powerful. And there's a lot here. So I'm looking at cognizant of time and appreciate the time you're spending with us. So I just have one last question, and I'm going to ask you, I'm sure some of my listeners are going to want to reach out to you and hear more from you. So, how can they get in touch with you, your website, your contact information? But I don't want to let you go without asking this question. And that is, how do you, or what would you recommend for sales professionals when they're dealing with misalignment within the organization? So the executive that I'm talking to is on board. However, other key stakeholders are, they have different incentives. They are prioritizing other objectives. And so there's some misalignment, say, between nursing and operations. And what we're doing is for operations, but now there's an issue because nursing is not on side. How would you recommend that sales professionals deal with, or maybe a better question is, what have you seen in terms of how executives deal with these internal misalignments in order to ensure success?
That is a very loaded and difficult question. But I think part of the answer is in what we said, is identifying the stakeholders early on. And it's not just stakeholders in a traditional sense. I like to think of them as influencers. These are people who hold the power to not just say yes to the sale, but they hold the power to make sure that your implementation is successful. So in my opinion, if I were to give the shortest possible answer, I don't think a win is possible unless the win is shared with the key influencers.
Okay.
And that would mean if I'm a salesperson, when I'm helping this person name the key influencers who have power in successfully executing on my service or product, I have to build the willingness that my win is contingent on a shared win. So you as a salesperson or me as a coach, if I'm working with just one person and not the team, I can't work with others or reach out to them. But my job is to coach this person to recognize the critical role that other people play and how they can bring them along. Of course, I would say if there was an opportunity, which is very different, this is a divergent point. Coaches don't do that unless they work with an entire team. But I think a salesperson can relieve some of the burden that executives already have a lot on their mind. Once they identify some of the key players, you can perhaps offer them to say, I'm willing to take a second seat and answer any questions. I'm willing to present from their perspective. Because
Yes.
if you think about CNO versus operations, I can see tons of commonalities. So I will start by, because you may be fixed in whatever the territorial issue may be in that specific system, but you can almost start by showing how much is common. When nurses thrive, or when operation, which is usually around flow, when flow is amazing, nurses are well off.
Yes.
So I will start by
Yes.
identifying what are the commonalities and then start by addressing what are the issues and help them negotiate the trade-off. It does
And
not need to be one and done.
And in fact, it sort of ties into what you said at the very outset of this conversation. And that is for sales professionals to have a strategic, longer term lens. And I
Hmm.
think as we move up and deal with more strategic objectives, those higher level objectives are something that the various leaders can actually galvanize around. Whereas if
Yes,
we're down at sort of an operational level, trying to
I
fix
like
one
that.
problem, I think that inherently has conflicts built in.
Oh, that is beautiful. That makes great sense. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And I'm fascinated by your observation of the parallels between sales and executive coaching. And I think because of this new approach of the hero's journey, where the customer is the hero, we want the salesperson not to be in this performance mindset, but to show up.
Hmm.
We call it the special resource or the mentor, the guide on the side, which is really the coach. And so I think that's really, really wonderful. How can people get in touch with you, Sandeep? You've shared a lot of wealth here, and I could talk to you for hours. It's just wonderful. But
Likewise.
how can people get in touch with you if they want to talk further?
I would be delighted to be in touch with your listeners. Email would be the best way. So Sandeep at multilevelleaders.com, which is one word, and or LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn. I
Beautiful.
am quite active and I actively post additional resources. So would be happy to share with you.
And we'll make sure that they have the proper spelling of your last name. Thank you so much for your generosity and your insight and wisdom. This is the High Stakes Customer Podcast. It's brought to you by Whetstone, where we believe that high stakes growth doesn't happen by accident. It happens when organizations align on how they understand their customers, how teams work together, and how decisions are executed under pressure. With Whetstone, we help you sell sharper and grow faster. I'm Adrian Davis, and I hope that you will listen, subscribe, share, and sharpen your own capability in the relationships that matter most to you. Thanks so much for joining us.